Hello, welcome to my uh, talking about something that I posted today entitled, What If We Had Bigger Brains? Imagining Minds Beyond Ours. So I'm going to go through what I wrote, and then hopefully we'll have time for some questions and discussion. Cats don't talk. We humans have perhaps 100 billion neurons in our brains, but what if we had many more? Or what if the AIs we built effectively had many more? What kinds of things might then become possible? At 100 billion neurons, we know, for example, that compositional language of the kind that we humans use is possible. At the 100 million or so neurons of a cat, it doesn't seem to be. But what would become possible with 100 trillion neurons? And is it even something we could imagine understanding? So my purpose here is to start exploring such questions, informed by what we've seen in recent years in neural nets and LLMs, as well as by what we now know about the fundamental nature of computation and about neuroscience, as well as the operation of actual brains. And now I have an actual picture of a brain that was the one that was writing this post. And so let's see. Um, Oops, why did that work? There is the relevant brain that was writing this. So one suggestive point about understanding larger brains is that as neural nets have gotten larger, they seem to have successively passed a sequence of thresholds in capability. So, for example, let me see here. Ooh, that's strange. So at about 100,000 connections, neural nets can recognize images of the 10 possible digits. At maybe 1 million connections, they can recognize images of all letters. At maybe 10 million connections, they can recognize images of 5,000 picturable nouns, like the image identifier that we released more than a decade ago now. And at 100 million connections, they can transcribe speech from audio. At maybe 1 billion connections, they can generate photorealistic images from text. And at maybe 100 billion connections, they can generate fluent natural language text. So the question is, what's next? Well, no doubt there'll be things like humanoid robotic control that have sort of close analogs in what we humans already do. But what if we go far beyond the 10 to the 14, 100 trillion connections that our human brains have? What qualitatively new kinds of capabilities might there then be? If this was about computation in general, then there wouldn't really be much to talk about. The principle of computational equivalence implies that beyond some sort of low threshold, the uh, computational systems can generically produce behavior that corresponds to computation that's as sophisticated as it can ever be. And indeed, that's the kind of thing we see in both in lots of abstract settings and in the natural world. But the point here is that we're not dealing with computation in general. We're dealing with the kinds of computations that brains fundamentally do. And the essence of these seems to have to do with taking in large amounts of sensory data and then coming up with what amount to decisions about what to do next. It's not obvious there'd be any reasonable way to do this. I mean, the world at large is full of computational irreducibility, where the only general way to work out what will happen in a system is just to run the underlying rules for that system step by step and see what comes out. So I have an example that I show of a complicated computational system that where it's hard to tell what the behavior is except by running every step. So yes, there are plenty of questions and issues for which there's essentially no choice but to kind of do this irreducible computation. just as there are plenty of cases where LLMs need to call on our Wolfram language computation system to get their computations done. But brains, for the things most important to them, somehow seem to routinely manage to kind of jump ahead without, in effect, simulating every detail. And what makes this possible is the fundamental fact that within any system that shows overall computational irreducibility, there must inevitably be an infinite number of pockets of computational reducibility, in effect associated with simplifying features of the behavior of a system. So it's these pockets of reducibility that brains exploit to be able to successfully navigate the world for their purposes, in spite of its background of computational irreducibility. And in these terms, things like the progress of science and technology can basically be thought of as the identification of progressively more pockets of computational reducibility. And we can then imagine that the capabilities of bigger brains could revolve around being able to sort of hold in mind more of these pockets of computational reducibility. So we can think of brains as fundamentally serving to compress the complexity of the world and extract from it just certain features associated with pockets of reducibility that we care about. And for us, a key manifestation of this is the idea of concepts and of language that uses them. So at the level of raw sensory input, we might see many detailed images of some category of thing, but language lets us describe them all just in terms of one particular symbolic concept, say rock. So in a rough first approximation, we can imagine that there's a direct correspondence between concepts and words in our language. And it's then notable that human languages all tend to have perhaps 30,000 common words or word-like constructs. So is that scale the result of the size of our brains? And could bigger brains perhaps deal with many more words, say millions or more? What could all these words be about, we might ask? After all, our everyday experience makes it seem like our current 30,000 words are quite sufficient to describe the world as it is. But in some sense, this is circular. We've invented the words we have because they're what we need to describe the aspects of the world we care about and want to talk about. There will be always more features of, say, the natural world that we could talk about. It's just that we haven't chosen to engage with them. For example, we could perfectly well invent words for all the detailed patterns of clouds in the sky, but those patterns are not something we currently feel the need to talk about in detail. But given our current set of words or concepts, is there closure to it? Can we successfully operate in a self-consistent slice of concept space, or will we always find ourselves needing new concepts? We might think of new concepts as being associated with intellectual progress that we choose to pursue or not. But insofar as the operation of the world is computationally irreducible, it's basically inevitable that we'll eventually be confronted with things that cannot be described by our current concepts. So why is it that the number of concepts or words isn't just always increasing? A fundamental reason is abstraction. Abstraction takes collections of potentially large numbers of specific things, tiger, lion, and so on, and allows them to be described abstractly in terms of a more general thing, say big cats. An abstraction is useful if it's possible to make collective statements about those more general things. All big cats have, etc. In effect, providing a consistent sort of higher level way of thinking about things. Well, if we imagine concepts as being associated with particular pockets of reducibility, the phenomenon of abstraction is then a reflection of the existence of networks of these pockets. And yes, such networks can themselves show computational irreducibility, which can then have its own pockets of reducibility and so on. So what about artificial neural nets? It's routine to look inside these and, for example, see the possible patterns of activation at a given layer based on a range of possible real-world inputs. We can then think of these patterns of activation as forming points in a feature space. And typically we'll be able to see clusters of these points, which we can potentially identify as emergent concepts that we can view as having been discovered by the neural net, or rather its training. Normally, there won't be existing words in human languages that correspond to most of these concepts. They represent pockets of reducibility, but not ones that we've identified and that are captured by our typical 30,000 or so words. And yes, even in today's neural nets, there can easily be millions of emergent concepts. But will these be useful abstractions or concepts, or merely incidental examples of compression not connected to anything else? The construction of neural nets implies that a pattern of emergent concepts at one layer will necessarily feed into the next layer. But the question is really whether the concept can somehow be useful independently, not just at this particular place in the neural net. And indeed, the most obvious everyday use for words and concepts and language in general is for communication, for transferring thoughts from one mind to another. Within a brain or a neural net, there are all kinds of complicated patterns of activity, different in each brain or each neural net. But a fundamental role that concepts, words, and language play is to define a way to package up certain features of that activity in a form that can be robustly transported between minds, somehow inducing comparable thoughts in all of them. The transfer from one mind to another can never be precise. In going from the pattern of activity in one brain or neural net to the pattern of activity in another, there'll always be translation involved. But at least up to a point, one can expect that the more that's said, the more faithful a translation can be. But what if there's a bigger brain with more emergent concepts inside? Then to communicate about them at a certain level of precision, we might need to use more words, if not a fundamentally richer form of language. And yes, while dogs seem to understand isolated words like sit and fetch and so on, we, with our larger brains, can deal with compositional language in which we can, in effect, construct an infinite range of meanings by combining words into phrases, sentences, and so on. So, at least as we currently imagine it, language defines a certain model of the world based on some finite collection of primitives, words, concepts, and so on. The existence of computational irreducibility tells us that such a model can never be complete. Instead, the model has to approximate things based on the network of pockets of reducibility that the primitives in the language effectively define. And insofar as a bigger brain might in essence be able to make use of a larger network of pockets of reducibility, it can then potentially support a more precise model of the world. And it could then be that if we look at such a brain and what it does, it will inevitably seem closer to the kind of incomprehensible and irreducible computation that's characteristic of so many abstract systems and systems in nature. But it could also be that in being a brain-like construct, it would necessarily tap into the computational reducibility in such a way that with the formalism and abstraction we built, we'd still meaningfully be able to talk about what it can do. So at the outset, we might have thought that any attempt for us to understand minds beyond ours would be like asking a cat to understand algebra. But somehow the universality of the concepts of computation that we now know, with their ability to address the deepest foundations of physics and other fields, makes it seem more plausible that we might now be in a position to meaningfully discuss minds beyond ours, or at least to discuss the rather more concrete question of what brains like ours, but bigger than ours, might be able to do. How brains seem to work. As I talked about, at least in a rough approximation, the role of brains is to turn large amounts of sensory input into small numbers of decisions about what to do. But how does this happen? Human brains continually receive input from a few million sensors, mostly associated with photoreceptors in our eyes and touch receptors in our skin. The input is processed by a total of about 100 billion neurons, each responding in a few milliseconds, mostly organized into a handful of layers. So there are altogether perhaps 100 trillion connections between neurons, many quite long range. At any given moment, a few percent of neurons, in other words, perhaps a billion, are firing. But in the end, all that activity seems to feed into particular structures in the lower part of the brain that in effect take a majority vote a few times a second to determine what to do next, in particular with a few hundred actuators that our bodies have. So this basic picture seems to be more or less the same in all higher animals. The total number of neurons scales roughly with the number of input sensors, or at a first approximation, the surface area of the animal, in other words, volume to the 2/3 power, which determines the number of touch sensors. The fraction of brain volume that consists of connections, white matter, as opposed to main parts of neurons, gray matter, increases as the power of the number of neurons. The largest brains, like ours, have a roughly nested pattern of folds that presumably reduce average connection lengths. Different parts of our brains have characteristic functions, like motor control, handling input from our eyes, generation of language, and so on, although there seems to be enough universality that other parts can usually learn to take over if necessary. And in terms of overall performance, animals with smaller brains generally seem to react faster to stimuli. So, what was it that made brains originally arise in biological evolution? Perhaps it had to do with giving animals a way to decide where to go next as they moved around. Plants, which don't move around, don't have brains in the same sense. And perhaps it's because animals can't go in more than one direction at once, that brains seem to have the fundamental feature of generating a single stream of decisions. And yes, this is probably why we have a single thread of conscious experience rather than a whole collection of experiences associated with the activities of all our neurons. And no doubt it's also why what we leverage in the construction of language and in communicating through a kind of one-dimensional sequence of tokens. So it's notable how similar our description of brains is to the basic operation of large language models. An LLM processes input from its context window by feeding it through large numbers of artificial neurons organized in layers, ultimately taking something like a majority vote to decide what token to generate next. There are differences, however, most notably that whereas brains routinely intersperse learning and thinking, current LLMs separate training from operation, in effect, learning first and thinking later. But almost certainly, the core capabilities of both brains and neural nets don't depend much on the details of their biological or architectural structure. It matters that there are many inputs and few outputs. It matters that there's irreducible computation inside. It matters that the systems are trained on the world as it is. And finally, it matters how big they are, in effect, relative to the number of relevant features of the world. In artificial neural nets, and presumably also in brains, memory is encoded in the strengths or weights of connections between neurons. And at least in neural nets, it seems that the number of tokens of textual data that can reasonably be remembered is a few times the number of weights. With current methods, the number of computational operations of training needed to achieve this is roughly the product of the total number of weights and the total number of tokens. So if there are too few weights, what happens is that the memory gets fuzzy, with details of the fuzziness reflecting details of the structure of the network. But what's crucial for both neural nets and brains is not so much to remember specifics of training data, but rather to do something reasonable for a wide range of inputs, regardless of whether they're in the training data, or in other words, to generalize appropriately from training data. But what is appropriate generalization? As a practical matter, it seems to be generalization that aligns with what we humans would do. And it's then a remarkable fact that artificial neural nets with fairly simple architectures can successfully do generalizations in a way that's roughly aligned with human brains. So why does this work? Presumably it's because there are universal features of brain-like systems that are close enough between human brains and neural nets. And once again, it's important to emphasize that what's happening in both cases seems distinctly weaker than general computation. A feature of general computation is that it can potentially involve unbounded amounts of time and storage space. But both brains and typical neural nets have just a fixed number of neurons. And although both brains and LLMs, in effect, have an outer loop that can recycle output to input, it's limited. And at least when it comes to brains, a key feature associated with this is the limit on working memory, i.e. memory that can readily be both read and written in the course of a computation. Bigger and more developed brains typically seem to support larger amounts of working memory. Adult humans can remember perhaps 5 or 7 chunks of data in working memory. For young kids and other animals, it's less. Size of working memory, as we'll talk about later, seems to be important in things like language capabilities. And the fact that it's limited is no doubt one reason we can't generally run code in our brains. As we try to reflect on what our brains do, we're most aware of our stream of conscious thought. But that represents just a tiny fraction of all our neural activity. Most of the activity is much less like thought and much more like typical processes in nature, with lots of elements seemingly sort of doing their own thing. We might think of this as sort of an ocean of unconscious neural activity from which a thread of consensus thought is derived. Usually, much like in an artificial neural net, it's difficult to find much regularity in that unconscious activity. Though when one trains oneself to get to the point of being able to do something without thinking about it, that presumably happens by organizing some part of that activity. there's always a question of what kinds of things we can learn. We can't overcome computational irreducibility, but how broadly can we handle what's computationally reducible? Artificial neural nets show certain genericity in their operation, although some specific architectures are more efficient than others. It doesn't seem to matter much whether the input they're fed is images or text or numbers or whatever. And for our brains, it's probably the same, though what we've normally experienced and learnt from are the specific kinds of input that come from our eyes, our ears, and so on. And from these, we've ended up recognizing certain types of regularities that we've then used to guide our actions, set up our environment, and so on. And yes, this plugs into certain pockets of computational reducibility in the world, but there's always further one could go, and how that might work with brains bigger than ours is at the core of what we're trying to talk about here. Language and beyond. At some level, we can view our brains as serving to take the complexity of the world and extract from it a compressed representation that our finite minds can handle. But what is the structure of that representation? A central aspect of it is that it ignores many details of the original input, like particular configurations of pixels, or in other words, it effectively equivalences many different inputs together. But how then do we describe that equivalence class? Implementationally, say in a neural net, the equivalence class might correspond to an attractor to which many different initial conditions all evolve. In terms of the detailed pattern of activity in the neural net, the attractor will typically be very hard to describe. But on a larger scale, we can potentially just think of it as some kind of robust construct that represents a class of things, or what in terms of our process of thought, we might describe as a concept. At the lowest level, there's all sorts of complicated neural activity in our brains, most of it mired in computational irreducibility. But the thin thread of conscious experience that we extract from this, we can for many purposes treat as being made up of higher level units of thought, or essentially discrete concepts. And yes, it's certainly our typical human experience that robust constructs, and particularly ones from which other constructs can be built, will be discrete. In principle, one could imagine that there could be things like robust, continuous spaces of concepts, cat and dog and everything in between. But we don't have anything like the computational paradigm that shows us a consistent universal way that such things could fit together. There's no robust analog of computation theory for real numbers, for example. And somehow the success of the computational paradigm, potentially all the way down to the foundations of the physical universe, doesn't seem to leave much room for anything else. So, okay, let's imagine that we can represent our thread of conscious experience in terms of concepts. Well, that's close to saying that we're using language. We're packaging up the details of our neural activity into robust elements, which we can think of as concepts, and which are represented in language essentially by words. And not only does this packaging into language give a robust way for different brains to communicate, it also gives a single brain a robust way to remember and redeploy thoughts. Within one brain, one could imagine that one might be able to remember and think directly in terms of detailed low-level neural patterns. But no doubt the neural environment inside a brain is continually changing, not least because of its stream of sensory input. And so the only way to successfully preserve a thought across time is presumably to package it up in terms of robust elements, or essentially in terms of language. In other words, if we're going to be able to consistently think a particular thought, we probably have to formulate it in terms of something robust, like concepts. But okay, individual concepts are one thing, but language, at least, or at least human language, is based on putting together concepts in structured ways. One might take a noun, like cat, and qualify it with an adjective, like black, to form a phrase that's in effect a finer-grained version of the concept represented by the noun. And in a rough approximation, one can think of language as formed from trees of nested phrases like this. And insofar as the phrases are independent in their structure, in other words, context-free, we can parse such language by recursively understanding each phrase in turn, with the constraint that we can't do it if the nesting goes too deep for us to hold the necessary stack of intermediate steps in our working memory. So an important feature of ordinary human language is that it's ultimately presented in a sequential way. Even though it may consist of a nested tree of phrases, the words that are the leaves of that tree are spoken or written in a one-dimensional sequence. And yes, the fact that this is how it works is surely closely connected to the fact that our brains construct a single thread of conscious experience. In the actuality of the few thousand human languages currently in use, there's considerable superficial diversity, but also considerable fundamental commonality. For example, the same parts of speech, noun, verb, and so on, typically show up, as do concepts like subject and object. But the details of how words are put together and how things are indicated can be fairly different. Sometimes nouns have case endings. Sometimes there are separate prepositions. Sometimes verb tenses are indicated by annotating the verb, sometimes with extra words. And sometimes, for example, what would usually be whole phrases can be smooshed together into single words. It's not clear to what extent commonalities between languages are the result of shared history and to what extent they're consequences either of the particulars of our human sensory experience of the world or the particular construction of our brains. It's not too hard to get something like concepts to emerge in experiments on training neural nets to pass through a bottleneck that simulates a mind-to-mind communication channel. But how compositionality or grammatical structure might emerge is not clear. But okay, so what might change if we had bigger brains? If neural nets are a guide, one obvious thing is that we should be able to deal directly with a larger number of distinct concepts or words. So what consequences would this have? Presumably one's language would get grammatically shallower in the sense that what would otherwise have had to be said with nested phrases could now be said with individual words. And presumably this would tend to lead to faster communication requiring fewer words. But it would likely also lead to more rigid communication with less ability to tweak shades of meaning, say by changing just a few words in a phrase. And it would presumably also require longer training to learn what all the words mean. In a sense, we have a preview of what it's like to have more words whenever we deal with specialized versions of existing language, aimed, say, at particular technical fields. There are additional words of jargon available that make certain things faster to say, but require longer to learn. And with that jargon comes a certain rigidity in saying easily only what the jargon says and not something slightly different. So how else could language be different with a bigger brain? With larger working memory, one could presumably have more deeply nested phrases, but what about more sophisticated grammatical structures, say ones that aren't context-free in the sense that different nested phrases can't be parsed separately? My guess is that this quickly devolves into requiring arbitrary computation and runs into computational irreducibility. In principle, it's perfectly possible to have any program as the message one communicates. But if one has to run the program to determine its meaning, that's in general going to involve computational irreducibility. And the point is that with our assumptions about what brain-like systems do, that's something that's out of scope. Yes, one can construct a system, even with neurons, that can do it, but not with the single thread of decisions from sensory input workflow that seems characteristic of brains. There are finer gradations one could consider, like languages that are context sensitive but don't require general computation. But the principle of computational equivalence strongly suggests that the separation between nested context-free systems and ones associated with arbitrary computation is very thin. And there doesn't seem to be any particular reason to expect that the capabilities of a bigger brain would land right there. So said another way, the principle of computational equivalence says it's easy to have a system that can deal with arbitrary computation. It's just that such a system is not brain-like in its behavior. It's more like a typical system we see in nature. Okay, but what other additional features can one imagine for even roughly brain-like systems? One possibility is to go beyond the idea of a single thread of experience and to consider a multi-way system in which threads of experience can branch and merge. And yes, this is what we imagine happens at a low level in the physical universe, particularly in connection with quantum mechanics. And indeed, it's perfectly possible to imagine, for example, a quantum-like LLM system in which one generates a graph of different textual sequences. But just scaling up the number of neurons in a brain without changing the overall architecture won't get to this. We have to have a different multi-way architecture where we have a graph of consciousness rather than a stream of consciousness, and where in effect we're thinking a graph of thoughts, notably with thoughts themselves being able to branch and merge. In our practical use of language, it's most often communicated in spoken or written form, effectively as a one-dimensional sequence of tokens. But in math, for example, it's common to have a certain amount of 2D structure. And in general, there are all sorts of specialized, usually technical, diagrammatic representations in use, often based on using graphs and networks. We'll talk about a bit more later. What about general pictures? Normally, it's difficult for us to produce these, but in generative AI systems, it's basically easy. So could we then imagine directly communicating mental images from one mind to another? Maybe as a practical matter, some neural implant in our brain could aggregate neural signals from which a displayed image could be generated. But is there in fact something coherent that could be extracted from our brains in this way? Perhaps that can only happen after consensus is formed and we've reduced things to a much thinner thread of experience. Or in other words, perhaps the only robust way for us to think about images is in effect to reduce them to discrete concepts and language-like representations. But perhaps if we had the hardware to display images directly from our minds, it'd be a different story. And it's sort of sobering to imagine that perhaps the reason cats and dogs don't appear to have compositional language is just that they don't have the hardware to talk like we do, and it's too laborious for them to, type with their paws and so on. And by analogy, that if we had the hardware for displaying images, we discover we could also think very differently. Of course, in some small ways, we do have the ability to directly communicate with language. For example, in our use of gestures and body language. Right now, these seem like largely ancillary forms of communication. But yes, it's conceivable that with bigger brains, they could be more. When it comes to other animals, the story can be different. Cuttlefish are notable for dynamically producing elaborate patterns on their skin, giving them, in a sense, the hardware to communicate in pictures. But so far as one can tell, they produce just a small number of distinct patterns, and certainly nothing like a pictorial generalization of compositional language. In principle, one could imagine that sort of generalized cuttlefish could do things like dynamically run cellular automata on their skin, just like all sorts of animals statically do in the process of growth or development. But to decode such patterns, and thereby, in a sense, enable communicating in programs, would typically require irreducible amounts of computation that are beyond the capabilities of any standard brain-like system. Sensors and actuators. So we humans have raw inputs coming into our brains from a few million sensors distributed across our usual senses of touch and sight and hearing and taste and smell, together with balance and temperature and hunger and so on. In most cases, the detailed sensor inputs are not independent. In a typical visual scene, for example, neighboring pixels are highly correlated. And it doesn't seem to take many layers of neurons in our brains to distill our typical sensory experience from pure pieces of raw data to what we might view as more independent features. Of course, there'll usually be much more in the raw data than just those features, but the features typically correspond to aspects of the data that we've learned are useful to us, normally connected to pockets of computational reducibility that exist in the environment in which we operate. Are the features we pick out all we'll ever need? In the end, we typically want to derive a small stream of decisions or actions from all the data that comes in. But how many intermediate features do we need to get good decisions or actions? That really depends on two things. First, what our decisions and actions are like, and second, what our raw data is like. Early in the history of our species, everything was just about sort of indigenous human experience, what the natural world is like, and what we can do with our bodies. But as soon as we're dealing with technology, that changed. And in today's world, we're constantly exposed, for example, to visual input that comes not from the natural world, but say from digital displays. And yes, we often try to arrange our user experience to align with what's familiar from the natural world, say by having objects that sort of stay unchanged when they're moved across the screen. But it doesn't have to be that way. And indeed, it's easy, even with simple programs, to generate, for example, visual images very different from what we're used to. And in many such cases, it's very hard for us to tell what's going on in the image. Sometimes it'll just look too complicated. Sometimes it'll seem like it has pieces we should recognize, but we don't. When it's just too complicated, that's often a reflection of computational irreducibility. But when there are pieces we might think we should recognize, that can be a reflection of pockets of reducibility that we're just not familiar with. If we imagine a space of possible images, as we can readily produce with generative AI, there will be some that correspond to concepts and words that we're familiar with, but the vast majority will effectively lie in interconcept space, places where we could have concepts, but we don't, at least yet. So what could bigger brains do with all this? Potentially, they could handle more features and more concepts. Full computational irreducibility will always, in effect, ultimately overpower them. But when it comes to handling pockets of reducibility, they'll presumably be able to deal with more of them. So in the end, it's very much as one might expect. A bigger brain should be able to track more things going on, see more details, and so on. Brains of our size seem like they're in effect sufficient for indigenous human experience. But with technology in the picture, it's perfectly possible to overload them. Needless to say, technology in the form of filtering, data analysis, and so on can also reduce that overload, in effect taking raw input and bringing our actual experience of it closer to something indigenous. It's worth pointing out that while two brains of a given size might be able to deal with the same number of features or concepts, those features or concepts might be different. One brain might have learnt to talk about the world in terms of one set of primitives, such as certain basic colors, another in terms of a different set of primitives. But if both brains are sampling indigenous human experience in similar environments, one can expect that it should be possible to translate between these descriptions, just as it's generally possible to translate between things said in different human languages. But what if the brains are effectively sampling different slices of reality? What if one's using technology to convert different physical phenomena to forms like images that we can indigenously handle? Perhaps we're sensing different electromagnetic frequencies. Perhaps we're sensing molecular or chemical properties. Perhaps we're sensing something like fluid motion. The kinds of features that will be useful may be quite different in these different modalities. Indeed, even something as seemingly basic as the notion of an object may not be so relevant if our sensory experience is effectively of continuous fluid motion. In the end, what's useful will depend on what we can do. And once again, it depends on whether we're dealing with pure humans who can't, for example, move like octopuses, or with humans augmented by technology. And here we start to see an issue that relates to the basic capabilities of our brains. As pure humans, we have certain actuators, basically in the form of muscles, that we can indigenously operate. But with technology, it's perfectly possible for us to use quite different actuators in quite different configurations. And as a practical matter, with brains like ours, we may not be able to make them work. For example, while humans can control helicopters, they never managed to control quadcopters, at least not until digital flight controllers could do most of the work. In a sense, there were just too many degrees of freedom for brains like ours to deal with. Should bigger brains be able to do more? One would think so. And indeed, one can imagine testing this with artificial neural nets. In millipedes, for example, their actual brains seem to support only a couple of patterns of motion of their legs, roughly same phase and opposite phase. But one can imagine that with a bigger brain, all sorts of other patterns will become possible. So ultimately, there are two issues at stake here. The first is having a brain be able to independently address enough actuators, or in effect enough degrees of freedom. The second is having a brain be able to control those degrees of freedom. And for example, with mechanical degrees of freedom, there are again essentially issues of computational irreducibility. Looking at the space of possible configurations, say of millipede legs, does one effectively just have to trace the path to find out if and how one can get from one configuration to another? Or are there instead pockets of reducibility associated with regularities in the space of configurations that let one jump ahead and figure this out without tracing all the steps? It's those pockets of reducibility that brains can potentially make use of. So when it comes to our everyday kind of indigenous experience of the world, we're used to certain kinds of computational reducibility associated with, for example, familiar natural laws, say about motion of objects. But what if we were dealing with different experiences associated with different senses? For example, imagine, as with dogs, that our sense of smell was better developed than our sense of sight, as reflected by more nerves coming into our brains from our noses than our eyes. Our description of the world would then be quite different, based, for example, not on geometry revealed by line of sight arrival of light, but instead by the delivery of odors through fluid motion and diffusion, not to mention the probably several hundred dimensional space of odors compared to the red, green, blue space of colors. Once again, there would be features that could be identified and concepts that could be defined, but those might only be useful in an environment built for smell rather than one built for sight. And in the end, how many concepts will be useful? I don't think we have any way to know, but it certainly seems as if one can be a successful smell-based animal with a smaller brain, presumably supporting fewer concepts, than one needs as a successful sight-based animal. One feature of natural senses is that they tend to be spatially localized. An animal basically senses things only where it is. Talk about the case of social organisms later. But what if we had access to a distributed array of sensors, say associated with IoT devices? The effective laws of nature that one could perceive would then be different. Maybe there would be regularities that could be captured by a small number of concepts, but it seems more likely that the story would be more complicated, and that in effect, one would need a bigger brain to be able to keep track of what's going on and make use of whatever pockets of reducibility might exist. There are somewhat similar issues if one imagines changing the timescales for sensory input. Our perception of space, for example, depends on the fact that light travels fast enough that in the milliseconds it takes our brains to register the input. We've already received light from everything that's around us. But if our brains operated a million times faster, as digital electronics does, we'd instead be registering individual photons. And while our brains might aggregate these to something like what we ordinarily perceive, there may be all sorts of other, for example, quantum optics effects that would be more obvious. Abstraction. The more abstractly we try to think, the harder it seems to get. But would it get easier if we had bigger brains? And might there perhaps be fundamentally higher levels of abstraction that we could reach, but only if we had bigger brains? As a way to approach questions like these, let's begin by talking a bit about the history of the phenomenon of abstraction. We might already say that basic perception involves some abstraction, capturing as it does a filtered version of the world as it actually is. But perhaps we reach a different level when we start to ask what-if questions and to imagine how things in the world could be different than they are. But somehow when it comes to humans, it seems as if the greatest early leap in abstraction was the invention of language and the explicit delineation of concepts that could be quite far from our direct experience. The earliest written records tend to be rather a matter of fact, recording mostly as they do events and transactions. But already there are plenty of signs of abstraction, numbers independent of what they count, things that could happen in the future, the concept of money. There seems to be a certain pattern in the development of abstraction. One notices that some category of things one sees many times can be considered similar, then one packages these up into a concept, often described by a word. And in many cases, there's a certain kind of self-amplification. Once one has a word for something, as a modern example, say blog, it becomes easier for us to think about the thing, and we tend to see it or make it more often in the world around us. But what really makes abstraction take off is when we start building a whole tower of it, with one abstract concept recursively being based on others. Historically, this began quite slowly, and perhaps it was seen first in theology. There were glimmerings of it in things like early syllogistic logic, in which one started to be able to talk about the form of arguments, independent of their particulars. And then there was mathematics, where computation could be done just in terms of numbers, independent of where those numbers came from. And yes, while there were tables of sort of raw computational results, numbers were usually discussed in terms of what they were numbers of. And indeed, when it came to things like measures of weight, it took until surprisingly modern times for there to be an absolute abstract notion of weight, independent of whether it was weight of figs or weight of wool. The development of algebra in the early modern period can be considered an important step forward in abstraction. Now there were formulas that could be manipulated abstractly without even knowing what a particular number x stood for. But it would probably be fair to say that there was a major acceleration in abstraction in the 19th century with the development of formal systems that could be discussed in purely symbolic form, independent of what they might or might not actually represent. And it was from this tradition that modern notions of computation emerged, and indeed, particularly ones associated with symbolic computation, in which I personally extensively used. But the most obvious area in which towers of abstraction has been built is in mathematics. One might start with numbers that could count things, but soon one's onto variables, functions, spaces of functions, category theory, and a zillion other constructs that abstractly build on each other. The great value of abstraction is that it allows one to think about large classes of things all at once, instead of each separately. But how do these abstract concepts fit together? The issue is that it's in a way that's very remote from anything about which we have direct experience from our raw perception of the world. Yes, we can define concepts about transfinite numbers or higher categories, but they don't immediately relate to anything we're familiar with from our everyday experience. As a practical matter, one can often get a sense of how high something is on the tower of abstraction by seeing how much one has to explain to build up to it from raw experiential concepts. Just sometimes it turns out that actually, once one hears about a certain seemingly highly abstract concept, one can actually explain it surprisingly simply without going through the whole historical chain that led to it. A notable example of this is the concept of universal computation, which arose remarkably late in human intellectual history, but is now quite easy to explain, albeit particularly given its actual widespread embodiment in technology. But the more common case is that there's no choice but to explain a whole tower of concepts. At least in my experience, though, when one actually thinks about highly abstract things, one does it by making analogies to more familiar, more concrete things. The analogies may not be perfect, but they provide scaffolding which allows our brains to take what would otherwise be quite inaccessible steps. At some level, any abstraction is a reflection of a pocket of computational reducibility, because if a useful abstraction can be defined, what it means is that it's possible to say something in a summarized or reduced way, in effect jumping ahead without going through all the computational steps or engaging with all the details. And one can then think of towers of abstraction as being like networks of pockets of computational reducibility. But yes, it can be hard to navigate these. Underneath, there's lots of computational irreducibility, and if one is prepared to go through all the steps, one can often get an answer without all the conceptual difficulty of complex abstractions. But while computers can often go through all the steps, brains can't. And that's in a sense why we have to use abstraction. But inevitably, even if we're using abstraction and the pockets of computational reducibility associated with it, there'll be shadows of the computational irreducibility underneath. And in particular, if we try to explore everything, our network of pockets of reducibility will inevitably get complicated and ultimately also be mired in computational irreducibility, albeit with higher level constructs than in the computational irreducibility underneath. No finite brain will ever be able to go all the way, but it starts to seem likely that a bigger brain will be able to reach further in the network of abstraction. But what will it find there? How does the character of abstraction change when we take it further? So we'll be able to talk about this a bit more concretely when we talk about computational language in a few moments. But perhaps the main thing to say now is that, at least in my experience, most higher abstractions don't feel as if they're structurally different once one understands them. In other words, most of the time, it seems as if the same patterns of thought and reasoning that one applied in many other places can be applied there, just to different kinds of constructs. Sometimes, though, there seem to be exceptions, shocks to intuition that seem to separate what one's now thinking about from anything one's thought about before. For example, for me, this happened when I started looking broadly at the computational universe. I'd always assumed that simple rules would lead to simple behavior. But many years ago, I discovered that in the computational universe, this isn't true, hence computational irreducibility. And this led to a whole different paradigm for thinking about things. It feels a bit like in mathematics, where one can imagine one type of abstraction associated with different constructs out of which to form theorems, but where somehow there's another level uh, associated with different ways to build new theorems, or indeed whole spaces of theorems, or to um, uh, or indeed or to build proofs from proofs, or proofs from proofs of proofs, and so on. But the remarkable thing is that there seems to be an ultimate construct that encompasses it all, the Ruliad. We can describe the Ruliad as the entangled limit of all possible computations. We can also describe it as the limit of all possible abstractions. And it seems to lie underneath all physical reality, as well as all possible mathematics and so on. But we might ask, how do brains relate to it? Inevitably, it's full of computational irreducibility. And looked at as a whole, brains can't get far with it. But the key idea is to think about how brains as they are, with all their various features and limitations, will parse it. And what I've argued is that what brains as they are will perceive about the Ruliad are the core laws of physics and mathematics as we know them. In other words, it's because brains are the way they are that we perceive the laws of physics that we perceive. Would it be different for bigger brains? Not if they're the same kind of brains, because what seems to matter for the core laws of physics are really just two properties of observers. First, that they're computationally bounded, and second, that they believe they are persistent in time and have a single thread of experience through time. And both of these seem to be core features of what make brains brain-like rather than just arbitrary computational systems. So it's a remarkable thing that these features are sufficient to make the core laws of physics inevitable. But if we want to understand more about the physics we've constructed and the laws we've deduced, we probably have to understand more about what we are like as observers. And indeed, as I've talked about at some length elsewhere, even our physical scale, much bigger than molecules, much smaller than the whole universe, is, for example, important in giving us the particular experience and laws of physics that we have. Would this be different for bigger brains? Perhaps a little, but anything that something brain-like can do pales in comparison to the computational irreducibility that exists in the Ruliad and the natural world. Nevertheless, with every new pocket of computational reducibility that's reached, we get some new abstraction about the world, or in effect, some new law about how the world works. And as a practical matter, each such abstraction can allow us to build a whole collection of new ways of thinking about the world and making things in the world. It's challenging to trace this arc, because in a sense, it'll all be about things we never thought to think about before, goals we might define for ourselves that are built on a tower of abstraction far away from what we might think of as indigenous human goals. It's important to realize that there won't just be one tower of abstraction that can be built. There'll inevitably be an infinite network of pockets of computational reducibility, with each path leading to a different specific tower of abstraction. And indeed, the abstraction we have pursued reflect the particular arc of human intellectual history. Bigger brains, or AIs, have many possible directions they can go, each one defining a different path of history. One question to ask is to what extent reaching higher levels of abstraction is a matter of education, and to what extent it requires additional intrinsic capabilities of a brain. It is, I suspect, a mixture. Sometimes it's really just a question of knowing where that pocket of reducibility is, which is something we can learn from education. Sometimes, though, it's a question of navigating a network of pockets, which may only be possible when brains reach a certain level of computational ability. There's another thing to discuss related to education, and that's the fact that over time, more and more distinct pieces of knowledge get built up in our civilization. There was perhaps a time in history when a brain of our size could realistically commit to memory at least the basics of much of that knowledge. But today, that time has long passed. Yes, abstraction in effect compresses what one needs to know, but the continual addition of new and seemingly important knowledge across countless specialties makes it impossible for brains of our size to keep up. Plenty of that knowledge is, though, still quite siloed in different areas, but sometimes there are grand analogies to make, say pulling an idea from relativity theory and applying it to biological evolution. In a sense, such analogies reveal new abstractions, but to make them requires knowledge that spans many different areas. And that's a place where bigger brains, or AIs, can potentially do something that's in a fundamental way beyond us. Will there always be such grand analogies to make? The general growth of knowledge is inevitably a computationally irreducible process, and within it there will inevitably be pockets of reducibility. But how often in practice will one encounter sort of long-range connections across knowledge space? As a specific example, one can look at metamathematics, where such connections are manifest in theorems that link seemingly different areas of mathematics. And this example leads one to realize that at some deep level, grand analogies are in a sense inevitable. In the context of the Ruliad, one could think of different domains of knowledge as corresponding to different parts. But the nature of the Ruliad, encompassing as it does everything that is computationally possible, inevitably imbues it with a certain homogeneity, which implies that, as the principle of computational equivalence might suggest, there must ultimately be a correspondence between different areas. In practice, though, this correspondence may be at a very atomic or formal level, far below the kinds of descriptions based on pockets of reducibility that we imagine brains normally use. But okay, will it always take an expanding brain to keep up with the expanding knowledge we have? Computational irreducibility guarantees that there'll always be, in principle, be new knowledge to be had, separated from what's come before by irreducible amounts of computation. But then there's the question of whether in the end we'll care about it. After all, it could be that the knowledge we can add is so abstruse that it will never affect any practical decisions we have to make. And yes, to some extent that's true, which is why only some tiny fraction of the Earth's population will probably care about what I'm saying here. But another consequence of computational irreducibility is that there will always be surprises, and those can eventually push into focus even what at first seems like arbitrarily obscure knowledge. Computational language. Language in general, and computational language in particular, is arguably the greatest invention of our species. But is it somehow the top, the highest possible representation of things? Or if, for example, we had bigger brains, is there something beyond it that we could reach? Well, in some formal sense, yes. Compositional language is, at least in idealized form, is the top, because at least if it's allowed to include utterances of any length, then in some sense it can, in principle, encode arbitrary universal computations. But this really isn't true in any useful sense. And indeed, to apply ordinary compositional language in this way would require doing computationally irreducible computations. So we return to the question of what might in practice lie beyond ordinary human language. So I've wondered about this for a long time, but in the end, I realized that the most important clue is, in a sense, right in front of me, the concept of computational language that I've spent much of my life exploring. It's worth saying at the outset that the way computational language plays out for computers and for brains is somewhat different and in some respects complementary. In computers, you might specify something as a Wolfram language symbolic expression, and then the main action is to evaluate this expression, potentially running a long computation to find out what the expression evaluates to. Brains aren't set up to do long computations like this. For them, a Wolfram language expression is something to use in effect as a representation of thought. And yes, that's an important distinction between the computational language of concept of Wolfram language and standard programming languages, which are intended purely as a way to tell a computer what to do, not a way to represent thoughts. So what kinds of thoughts can we readily represent in our computational language? There are ones involving explicit numbers or mathematical expressions. There are ones involving cities and chemicals and other real-world entities. But then there are higher level ones that in effect describe more abstract structures. For example, there's nest list, which gives the result of any operation. Here, let's say named f. So for example, we could say nest list of f, x, 5, and we will get x, f of x, f of f of x, f of f of x, f of f of f of f of f of x, and so on. So at the outset, it's not obvious that this will be a useful thing to do, but in fact, it's a very successful abstraction. There are lots of functions f for which one wants to do this. In the development of ordinary human language, words tend to get introduced when they're useful, or in other words, when they express things one often wants to express. But somehow in human language, the words one gets tend to be more concrete. Maybe they describe something that directly happens to objects in the world. Maybe they describe our impression of a human mental state. Yes, one can make rather vague statements like, I'm going to do something to someone, but human language doesn't normally go meta, doing things like nest list, where one's saying that that one wants to make some direct statement and in effect work with the statement. One wants to take that direct statement and in a sense work with the statement. In some sense, human language tends to work with data, applying a simple analog of code to it. Our computational language can work with code as raw material. One could think about this as a higher order function, a function that operates not on data, but on functions. And one can keep going, dealing with functions that operate on functions that operate on functions, and so on. And at every level, one is increasing the generality and abstraction at which one is working. There may be specific functions a bit analogous to verbs that operate on data, a bit analogous to nouns. But when we talk about operating on functions themselves, we can potentially have just a single function like nest list that operates quite generally on many functions. In ordinary language, one might call such things kind of meta verbs, but they aren't something that commonly occurs. But what makes them possible in computational language? Well, it's taking the computational paradigm seriously and representing everything in computational terms, objects, actions, etc. In Wolfram language, it's that we can represent everything as a symbolic expression. Arrays of numbers or countries or whatever are symbolic expressions. Graphics are symbolic expressions. Programs are symbolic expressions, and so on. And given this uniformity of representation, it becomes feasible and natural to do higher order operations that in effect manipulate symbolic structure without being concerned what the structure might represent. At some level, we can view this as leading to sort of the ultimate abstraction embodied in the Ruliad, where in a sense everything is pure structure. But in practice in Wolfram language, we try to anchor what we're doing to known concepts from human language so that we can use names for things like nest list that are derived from common English words. In some formal sense, this isn't necessary. Everything can be purely structural, as it is not only in the Ruliad, but also in constructs like combinators, where, for example, the operation of addition can be represented by an expression like s dot k dot s dot s dot k dot s dot k dot s dot k. Combinators have been around for more than a century, but they're almost impenetrably difficult for most humans to understand. Somehow they involve too much pure abstraction, not anchored to concepts we have a sense of in our brains. It's been interesting for me to observe over the years what it's taken for people, including myself, to come to terms with the kind of higher order constructs that exists in the Wolfram language. The typical pattern is that over the course of months or years, one gets used to lots of specific cases. And only after that is one able, often in the end rather rapidly, to get to the next level and start to use some generalized higher order construct. But normally one can in effect only go one level at a time. After one groks one level of abstraction, that seems to have to settle for a while before one can go on to the next one. Somehow it seems as if one's gradually feeling out a certain amount of computational irreducibility to learn about a new pocket of reducibility that one can eventually use to think in terms of. Could having a bigger brain speed this up? Maybe it'd be useful to be able to remember more cases and perhaps get more into working memory. But I rather suspect that combinators, for example, are in some sense fundamentally beyond all brain-like systems. It's much as the principle of computational equivalence suggests, one quickly ascends to things that are as computationally sophisticated as anything, and therefore inevitably involve computational irreducibility. There are only certain specific setups that remain within the computationally bounded domain that brain-like systems can deal with. Of course, even though they can't directly run code in their brains, humans and LLMs can perfectly well use Wolfram language as a tool, getting it to actually run computations. And this means that they can readily observe phenomena that are computationally reducible. Indeed, in the end, it's very much the same kind of thing as observing such phenomena in the abstract computational universe and in the real physical universe. And the point is that in both cases, brain-like systems will pull out only certain features, essentially corresponding to pockets of computational reducibility. How do things like higher order functions relate to this? At this point, it's not completely clear. I mean, presumably, in at least some sense, there are hierarchies of higher order functions that capture certain kinds of regularities that can be thought of as associated with networks of computational reducibility. And uh, it's conceivable that uh, category theory and its higher order generalizations are relevant here. I mean, in category theory, one imagines applying sequences of functions, morphisms, and it's a foundational assumption that the effect of any sequence of functions can also be represented by just a single function, which seems tantamount to saying that one can always jump ahead, or in other words, that everything one's dealing with is computationally reducible. Higher order category theory can then effectively extend this to higher order functions, but always with what seems like assumptions of computational reducibility. And yes, this all seems highly abstract and difficult to understand, but does it really need to be? Or is there some way to bring it down to a level that's close to everyday human thinking? It's not clear. But in a sense, the core art of computational language design that I myself have practiced so assiduously for nearly half a century is precisely to take things that at first might seem abstruse and somehow cast them into an accessible form. And yes, this is something that's about as intellectually challenging as anything, because in a sense, it involves continually trying to figure out what's really going on and in effect drilling down to get to the foundations of everything. But okay, when one gets there, how simple will things be? Part of that depends on how much computational irreducibility is left when one reaches what one considers to be the foundations. And part, in a sense, depends on the extent to which one can find a bridge between the foundations and something that's familiar. Of course, what's familiar can change. And indeed, over the past 4 decades that I've been developing Wolfram language, quite a few things, particularly in areas like functional programming, that at first seemed abstruse and unfamiliar, have begun to seem more familiar. And yes, it's taken the collective development and dissemination of the relevant ideas to achieve that. But now it just takes education. It doesn't take a bigger brain to deal with those things. One of the core features of the Wolfram language is that it represents everything as a symbolic expression. And yes, symbolic expressions are formally able to represent any kind of computational structure. But beyond that, the important point is that they're somehow set up to be a match for how brains work. And in particular, symbolic expressions can be thought of grammatically as consisting of nested functions that form a tree-like structure, effectively a more precise version of the typical kind of grammar that we find in human language. And yes, just as we managed to understand and generate human language with limited working memory, so, at least at the grammatical level, we can do the same thing with computational language. In other words, in dealing with Wolfram language, we're leveraging our faculties with human language, and that's why Wolfram language can serve as such an effective bridge between the way we think about things and what's computationally possible. But symbolic expressions represented as trees aren't the only conceivable structures. It's also possible to have symbolic expressions where the elements are nodes on a graph, and the graph can even have loops in it. Or one can go even further and start talking, for example, about the hypergraphs that appear in our physics project. But the point is that brain-like structures have a hard time processing such structures. Because to keep track of what's going on, they in a sense have to keep track of multiple threads of thought. And that's not something individual brain-like systems, as we currently envision them, can do. Many brains together, the formation of society. As we talked about several times here, it seems to be a key feature of brains that they create a single thread of experience. But what would it be like to have multiple threads? Well, actually, we have a very familiar example of that. What happens when we have a whole collection of people or other animals? One can imagine that biological evolution might have produced animals whose brains maintain multiple simultaneous threads of experience. But somehow it has ended up instead restricting each individual animal to just one thread of experience and getting multiple threads by having multiple animals. Conceivably, creatures like octopuses may actually, in some sense, support multiple threads within one organism, one per tentacle or something. Within a single brain, it seems important to always sort of come to a single definite conclusion, say to determine where an animal will move next. But what about in a collection of organisms? Well, there's still some kind of coordination that will be important to the fitness of the whole population, perhaps even something as direct as moving together as a herd or a flock. And in a sense, just as all those different neuron firings in one brain get collected to determine a final conclusion for what to do, so similarly, the conclusions of many different brains have to be collected to determine a coordinated outcome. But how can a coordinated outcome arise? Well, there has to be communication of some sort between organisms. Sometimes it's rather passive, just watch what your neighbor in a herd or flock does. Sometimes it's something more elaborate and active, like language. But is that the best one can do? One might imagine that there could be some kind of telepathic coordination in which the raw pattern of neuron firings is communicated from one brain to another. But as I talked about, such communication can't be expected to be robust. To achieve robustness, one must package up all the internal details into some standardized form of communication, words or roars or calls or whatever, that one can expect to be faithfully unpacked and in effect understood by other suitably similar brains. But it's important to realize that the very possibility of such standardized communication in effect requires coordination, because somehow what goes on in one brain has to be aligned with what goes on in another. Indeed, the way that's maintained is precisely through continual communication. Okay, so how might bigger brains affect this? One possibility is that they might enable more complex social structures. There are plenty of animals with fairly small brains that successfully do all the same thing, flocks and herds and so on. But the larger brains of primates seem to allow more complex tribal structures. Could having a bigger brain let one successfully maintain a larger social structure, in effect remembering and handling larger numbers of social connections? Or could the actual forms of these connections be more complex? While human social connections seem to be at least roughly captured by social networks represented as ordinary graphs, maybe bigger brains would, for example, routinely require hypergraphs. But in general, we can say that language or standardized communication of some form is deeply connected to the existence of a coherent society. Without being able to exchange something like language, there's no way to align the members of a potential society. And without coherence between members, something like language won't be useful. As in so many other situations, one can expect that the detailed interactions between members of a society will show all sorts of computational irreducibility. And insofar as one can identify the will of society, or for that matter, the tide of history, it represents a pocket of computational reducibility in the system. In human society, there's a considerable tendency, though it's often not successful, to try to maintain a single thread of society in which at some level everyone is supposed to act more or less the same. And certainly there's an important simplifying feature in allowing brains like ours, that's an important simplifying feature in allowing brains like ours to sort of navigate the social world. Could bigger brains do something more sophisticated? As in other areas, one can imagine a whole network of regularities or pockets of reducibility in the structure of society, perhaps connected to a whole tower of higher order social abstractions that only bigger brains than ours can comfortably deal with. Just being friends might be a story for the small-brained. With bigger brains, one might instead have patterns of dependence and connectivity that can only be represented in complicated graph theoretic ways. Well, summarizing minds beyond ours. We humans have a tremendous tendency to think, or at least hope, that our minds are somehow at the top of what's possible. But with what we now know about computation and how it operates in the natural world, it's pretty clear that this isn't true. Indeed, it seems as if it's precisely a limitation in the computational architecture of our minds and brains that leads to that most cherished feature of our existence that we characterize as conscious experience. In the natural world at large, computation is in some sense happening quite uniformly everywhere. But our brains seem to be set up to do computation in a more directed and more limited way, taking in large amounts of sensory data, but then filtering it down to a small stream of actions to take. And yes, one can remove this limitation, and while the result may lead to more computation getting done, it doesn't lead to something that's a mind like ours. And indeed, in what I've talked about here, we've tended to be very conservative in how we imagine extending our minds. We mostly just talked about what might happen if our brains were scaled up to have more neurons, while basically maintaining the same structure. And yes, animals physically bigger than us already have larger brains, as did Neanderthals. But what we really need to look at is the size of brain relative to the size of animal, or in effect, the amount of brain for a given amount of sensory input. A certain amount about what happens with different scales of brains is already fairly clear from looking at different kinds of animals and at things like their apparent lack of human-like language. But now that we have artificial neural nets that do remarkably human-like things, we're in a position to get a more systematic sense of what different scales of brains can do. And indeed, we've seen a sequence of sort of capability thresholds passed as neural nets get larger. So what will bigger brains be able to do? What's fairly straightforward is that they'll presumably be able to tackle larger amounts of sensory input, generate larger amounts of output. And yes, the sensory input could come from existing modalities or new ones, and the outputs could go to existing actuators or new ones. As a practical matter, the more data that has to be processed for a brain to come to a decision and generate an output, the slower it'll probably be. But as brains get bigger, so presumably will the size of their working memory, as well as the number of distinct concepts they can distinguish and remember. If the same overall architecture is maintained, there'll just be a single thread of experience associated with a single thread of communication or a single stream of tokens. At the size of brains we have, we can deal with compositional language in which concepts, represented basically as words, can have at least a certain depth of qualifiers, corresponding, say, to adjectival phrases. As brain size increases, we can expect that there can be both more raw concepts, allowing fewer qualifiers, as well as more working memory to deal with more deeply nested qualifiers. But is there something qualitatively different that can happen with bigger brains? Computational language, and particularly my experience with Wolfram language, gives some indications, the most notable of which is the idea of kind of going meta and using higher order constructs. Instead of, say, operating directly on raw constructs with, say, verb-like functions, we can imagine higher order functions that operate on functions themselves. And yes, this is something of which we see powerful examples in Wolfram language, but it feels as if we could somehow go further and make this more routine if our brains, in a sense, had more capacity. To go meta and use higher order constructs is in effect a story of abstraction and of taking many disparate things and abstracting to the point where one can talk about them all together. The world at large is full of complexity and computational irreducibility, but in essence, what makes minds like ours possible is that there are pockets of computational reducibility to be found. And those pockets of reducibility are closely related to being able to successfully do abstraction. And as we build up towers of abstraction, we're in effect navigating through networks of pockets of computational reducibility. The progress of knowledge and the fact that we're educated about it lets us get to a certain level of abstraction. And one suspects the more capacity there is in a brain, the further it will be able to go. But where will it want to go? The world at large, full as it is with computational irreducibility, along with infinite numbers of pockets of reducibility, leaves infinite possibilities. And it's largely the coincidence of our particular history that defines the path we've taken. We often identify our sense of purpose with the path we will take, and perhaps the definiteness of our belief in purpose is related to the particular feature of brains that leads us to concentrate on everything we're thinking down onto a single stream of decisions and action. And yes, as we talked about, one could in principle imagine multi-way minds with multiple threads of consciousness operating at once. But we humans and individual animals in general don't seem to have those. Of course, in collections of animals or humans, there are still inevitably multiple threads of consciousness, and it's things like language that knit together those threads, for example, to for example, make a coherent society. Quite what that knitting looks like might change as we scale up the size of brains. So, for example, with bigger brains, we might be able to deal with higher order societal structures that would seem alien and incomprehensible to us today. So what would it be like to interact with a bigger brain? Inside, that brain might effectively use more words and concepts than we know, but presumably it could still generate at least a rough, explain like I'm five approximation that we'd be able to understand. There might well be all sorts of abstractions and higher order constructs that we're basically blind to. And yes, one is sort of reminded of something like a dog listening to a human conversation about philosophy and catching only the occasional sit or fetch word. So as we've talked about several times here, if we remove our restriction to brain-like operation, and in particular to deriving a small stream of decisions from large amounts of sensory input, we're thrown into the domain of general computation, where computational irreducibility is rampant, and we can't in general expect to say much about what's going on. But if we maintain brain-like operation, we're instead in effect navigating through networks of computational reducibility, and we can expect to talk about things like concepts, language, and towers of abstraction. From a foundational point of view, we can imagine any mind as in effect being at a particular place in the Ruliad. When minds communicate, they're effectively exchanging the Rulial analog of particles, robust constructs, the concepts that are somehow unchanged as they propagate within the Ruliad. So what would happen if we had bigger brains? In a sense, it's a surprisingly mechanical story. A bigger brain encompassing more concepts and so on, in effect, just occupies a larger region of Rulial space. And the presence of abstraction, perhaps learnt from the whole arc of intellectual history, can lead to more expansion in Rulial space. And in the end, it seems that minds beyond ours can be characterized by how large the regions of the Ruliad they occupy are. Such minds are, in some very literal Rulial sense, more broad-minded. So what is the limit of all this? Ultimately, it's a mind that spans the whole Ruliad and in effect incorporates all possible computations. But in some fundamental sense, this is not a mind like ours, not least because by being everything, it becomes nothing. And one can no longer identify it as having a coherent thread of individual existence. And yes, the overall thrust of what we've been saying applies just as well to AI minds as to biological ones. If we remove restrictions like being set up to generate the next token, we'll be left with a neural net that's just doing computation with no obvious mind-like purpose in sight. But if we make neural nets that do typical brain-like tasks, then we can expect that they too will find and navigate pockets of reducibility. We may well not recognize what they're doing, but insofar as we can, then inevitably we'll mostly be sampling the parts of minds beyond ours that are aligned with minds like ours. And it'll take progress in our whole intellectual edifice to be able to fully appreciate what it is that minds beyond ours can do. Well, that's what I wrote and posted today. So now I would be happy to try and address some questions or comments about all of that. So let's see, what do we have here? Let's see. Sorry, I'm just a little confused about what I'm seeing here. Oh, okay. These are questions from a different thing. Hold on. Gosh, very confused here. Here we go. Okay, now I'm at the right thing. I was very confused. All right. Mark asks, if a mind spanned the entire Ruliad, would it dissolve into totality or gain the capacity to localize perspective anywhere? You know, it's a funny thing to think about a mind spanning the Ruliad because in a sense, the Ruliad is everything, the whole universe and everything. It's a very kind of a mind that is everything and spans everything is something that I don't think we could say that it is it's an individual with coherent existence. it's just something that is sort of spanning everything. It doesn't have a this is the particulars of what this thing is doing. So I think it really is a it really dissolves um, into into something that is no longer has the coherence of an individual. I mean, the way we experience minds is as individuals, and that really isn't a thing you can do if you span the whole Ruliad. Let's see. Uh, let's see. Um, Doom is asking, would a faster brain be better than a bigger brain? Um, that's a reasonable question. Um, I think it's really an issue of sort of how much can you store. And I think if it's a question of can you run code in your brain, I think that's much more a question of working memory and storage than it is a question of speed. I mean, it doesn't do you any good to kind of having be able to run everything fast if you can't maintain the thing you're running. Um, how would speed of brains sort of affect things? Within society, one is dealing with kind of the interaction with language at a certain rate. If everybody talked twice as fast, what would that mean? You know, in other words, if everybody could think twice as fast, how would that affect things that can be done? It's certainly true that, if you think faster, you can do mechanical things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. That's why when you train yourself extensively to the point where you can do things without thinking about them, you can do them faster than if you have to think about them, maybe in half the time, let's say. And then there are lots of kinds of things that might be useful in the world that you can then do in you can do faster. So in terms of sort of if the world is mostly running at such and such a rate, if you become the person or the critter that is able to do things at twice the rate or 10 times the rate or whatever, then yes, surely interesting things can be done. You can sort of win out over the rest of the world. If everything speeds up, it doesn't really count. And certain kinds of things, you could think incredibly fast, but you still can't move your fingers fast enough to make that to do much with it. And it probably would be very frustrating if you could think a lot faster, but you can't get your fingers to move fast enough. I mean, one has that experience. Sometimes one can think of something, but it's a question of typing it or something like this, and that sort of just takes a long time to do. And I kind of think that's a lot of the experience one would have with a faster brain, unless everything else was faster. And if everything is faster, it's not, that just means one's sort of living life at a different, living life faster. And I think it sort of feels the same as it does right now, I think. Ryan is asking, a bit sci-fi, but would it be possible to synthesize and integrate new kinds of neurons into our brains? There's a bunch of different questions here. I mean, if you just think about neurons grown from stem cells and so on, maybe from your own stem cells, and you plonk them in your brain, will they sort of migrate to the right place and start forming connections and so on? The answer to that is quite possibly yes. It will be, you'll end up with a modest amount of sort of additional brain material, particularly relevant if some brain material was destroyed and so on. How sort of memories will flow into that new material is not very clear, but the concept of, pump in twice the number of neurons, I think quite literally one's head would explode type thing if one tried to do that. But in terms of so that's sort of one question of sort of neurons as they are right now. Another question is uh, kinds of neurons. Let's say we could make a sort of we could use nanotech of some kind to make a better neuron, and then we start populating brains, seeding brains with better neurons. That would be an interesting situation. I mean, I kind of feel like the the gradualness of kind of you just feeding in a few extra neurons. And then, this week you're using those few extra neurons and memories are spreading into those and so on. Next week, there are a few more and so on. I feel like that might be an interesting experience. I mean, we have to remember that our own kind of belief in our own sort of continued thread of experience happens even though the particular cells in our bodies are turning over at some rate, neurons at a much slower rate than other things, but nevertheless, we kind of still think we have the same, we have lots of things the same, even though the detailed, skin cells and all those kinds of cells are turning over. But I think my so what would it feel like if one started in inserting sort of better, faster neurons to kind of coexist with the ones one already has? It's an interesting question. I don't know. It's I think I became a bit more pessimistic about kind of direct neural interfaces to electronics, for example, realizing that I'm not sure how useful it is, picking up the sort of unconscious signals that are all a big computationally irreducible mess. It's not completely clear what that does for one. I mean, maybe you pick up some computationally irreducible mess and you decode some aspect of it and you feed back some other computational irreducible mess that has sort of answered the results of computations. Maybe that works. I think that for an awful lot of what one wants to do, one already has to have formed concepts, formed thoughts to be able to outsource them. And it's kind of like when you watch an LLM at work. Right now, LLMs don't get to call Wolfram language or other tools without having sort of formulated the words to call those tools. If you said, let's inject into the innards of the neural net something which can call Wolfram language and do computations and get back knowledge results and so on, we don't know how to do that. We only know how to take the thing kind of at the outer level where it's formed words, formed thoughts in a robust way and feed that to the tools. And I kind of think the same is true in at least what we imagine right now about how brains work. Let's see. Ryan is also asking, we've transplanted human neurons into rats. Can we create and transplant neurons that we've never seen before? Well, I don't know. I mean, a case in point is this company that's making brain organoids that are disembodied brain organoids. They're a bit more disorganized than current brain tissue, at least right now. There's no scaffold that makes them organize in the way that brains organize. It's a very bizarre concept to imagine taking one's own, for example, stem cells for neurons and growing oneself sort of a second brain that is sitting in this machine that and where communication with it isn't trivial, because to build something which has eyes and spinal cords and all that kind of thing, that's a heavy lift which is not even close at this time. But it is an interesting thing to imagine. What would it be like to sort of grow that organoid and just keep growing it bigger and bigger and bigger, and maybe it's even your own brain tissue, so to speak. And then what happens when you have it start sort of learning as you learn? I don't know. It's also a kind of ethical quagmire about what you do with this sort of brain-like thing that doesn't have the feature that it's embedded in a human as we understand humans right now, but might be a human brain at some level. Let's see. Phobos comments, my view on questions of human modification cybernetics is that it will never succeed, i.e. be better than biological evolution without significant energy expenditure. It took millions of years to get to where we are. It's an interesting issue to what extent we can sort of discover what is computationally useful by adaptive evolution versus by things like exhaustive search versus by engineering things. When we are trying to do things which are made in our own image and which relate to our own ways of thinking, engineering is pretty good because we're sort of already tied to our own way of thinking. When we write code in Wolfram language, we're already tied to our own way of thinking. If we were to generate that code for example, by enumerating all possible code, what we get, while it might turn out to be useful in some case, will be incomprehensible to us in its structure typically. And the sort of the intermediate case of adaptive evolution, where we kind of define the fitness function and then we just sort of randomly mutate things to get to that point, I've studied that actually quite a bit quite recently, both in the context of biological evolution and the context of machine learning. And the main takeaway is what you end up getting is lumps of irreducible computation kind of put together to achieve the fitness function you want. And one of the issues there is that those lumps tend to be incomprehensible. But so the question is, are there things that could be useful in sort of defining kind of extensions to mind-like things that are engineered versus that are discovered through a process like biological evolution, like adaptive evolution, like exhaustive search? Well, I personally believe so, which is why I just spent the last nearly half a century trying to build such things, trying to use kind of human mind capabilities to try to crispen up kind of the representation of things computationally within computational language and specifically within Wolfram language, um, to try to sort of take the ways that we have to think about things and make them sort of crisp and formal and buildable on top of. Because one of the things about human thinking is that the way we normally do it, it's normally pretty flat. It's normally we just think about something and then maybe we think about something else and so on. The idea of sort of automatically building a big tower of thoughts isn't so much a thing. That is a thing when we get to do things computationally and when we can start building in these towers once we formalized what we're thinking about. If we were just sort of making arguments and trying to remember how the arguments worked, it will be hard for us to build up a big tower of logic. Once we have the formalization of logic, well, then we can build big towers of logic and make microprocessors with billions of logical gates and all this kind of thing. So it's I think the so my feeling is if we want to connect to the way we humans are right now, and that's the thing I think we care the most about, then doing things like the half century I just spent building computational language is worthwhile. If we want to merely say what's in principle possible in the computational universe, then don't do that. Just go out into the computational universe and see what's there, something I've also spent quite a bit of effort doing. What's there is certainly mind expanding, but it's also very alien. It's not like it requires us to expand our minds to get to things that we hadn't thought about before. The things we had thought about before, sort of building a tower based on what we had thought about before, I think that's much more a story of engineering and a story of inventing things like computational language. Um, but it is the case that sort of the certain kinds of things we can find and be able to do are sort of magic solutions are found by adaptive evolution or by exhaustively searching possible programs. An interesting question is what is the space of things that can be achieved by adaptive evolution? That is, we define certain fitness functions for where we're trying to get to. Which ones are gettable to by adaptive evolution of certain kinds? It's kind of like, what could biology be like? People would say, well, can we have wheels? Well, there are little tiny wheels in bacteria and things like this. But can we? That's a very simple-minded example. Is it what kinds of things, what kinds of capabilities are conceivably reachable by adaptive evolution and what are not? We don't know. I've been interested in that question. I think that question is important, but we just don't know the answer. It's a thing where sort of characterizing what I've been doing with computational language is kind of starting from the way we think about things and kind of building a tower of where can we get to by formalizing those things. It's a different question, sort of, if what could we sort of fill in the machinery for if we just define it and say, imagine a thing like this. Now, it's a little bit of a circular issue because even the defining of things requires some kind of description language or something. And that description language has to be built in a certain way. And the what can happen in the computational universe in general, something I've studied a lot, what can happen is very unexpected, very alien, and very unconnected to things that we can see the point of right now. So I think it's a complicated sort of circular thing of what can we know the point of versus what is sort of just happening in the computational universe. Tarek comments that they should make a digital copy of me. Um, and yes, I think that's an interesting thing. I've been sort of picking away at that, and some other people have worked on that a bit. I have to say, particularly this particular piece that I wrote about bigger brains here, um, I thought this was going to be easy. It turned out to be really quite hard. And it also turned out to be something that kind of pulls in a lot of things I've thought about over the last many decades, actually. And one of the things that I was sort of frustrated by in writing this piece was was realizing I've forgotten, I know I thought about this or that thing, and I'm pretty sure I wrote about it somewhere, but I can't search for it because the thing I'm searching for is a concept. And we have some RAG type technology that we built around things I've written, but it wasn't really quite adequate or streamlined enough to be able to use it for this purpose. But I'd really like that. I don't know if it'd be useful to other people, but I'd really like that. And certainly there's quite a lot of raw material. There's 50 million words of yakking of mine that exists in transcript form that one can use to train an LLM. Um, Yast asks, I wonder what form of language we would use if we thought like a neural net. Well, the thing is that neural nets are trained, a neural net in the wild, not trained on anything, just does random stuff. It does computations, it does something, but those things seem quite useless to us. The neural nets that seem useful to us are the ones that are trained on us related things, which means existing human language, for example. So, so we tend to be sort of, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that the neural net will sort of work with things like existing human languages. That's what we trained on. When you look inside the neural net, it has sort of an inner language which is very hard for us to understand, basically impossible for us to understand. I kind of think from the work that I've done on foundations of machine learning that that in some sense it's fundamentally incomprehensible what's happening inside, that it's fundamentally just lumps of irreducible computation about which one cannot make kind of very broad statements. So I think that's uh, so I think the neural net that's just a neural net plunked down with with sort of arbitrary uh, connection strengths, weights, and so on. It just does random stuff. It does do definite stuff, but it's stuff where we don't know why it's important or relevant. In fact, it's an interesting question. If you just pick sort of the programming of the neural net at random, can one characterize what the neural net is typically likely to do? That's something I spent some effort on, and it's not so easy to figure out. Let's see. Um, Harry asks, did you calculate at what point we would not stop eating because the brain is so big and energy hungry? How would we get rid of the excess heat? Kind of reminds me of a claim attributed to ancient Greeks, although I think they didn't really think this, that the brain was just a cooling mechanism for the body, and all the real thinking happened in the heart type thing, because that was the thing that you could tell something was going on in when you looked at human bodies. But uh, there's a bunch of things that are going wrong. I mean, our brains are all crinkled up because they're trying to shorten the distance to between the connections have to go. And if you look at brains, there's a kind of 5/4 law of the amount of white matter compared to gray matter, and that reflects the fact that as you get a bigger brain and you try to connect lots of things together, it eventually becomes sort of all wire. And our brains are, there's more white matter than gray matter. It's a lot of wire in there that is connecting things, not the bodies of cells really sort of doing things. In terms of how much energy one has to use, I mean, brains are really efficient. Can be, we're a 50-watt operation, whereas much smaller than most servers and so on. So I think as as brains get bigger, for sure they have to consume, that you need to run all those neurons, and that requires lots of, glucose and ADP, ATP and metabolism and all those kinds of things. I don't know whether um, I don't know whether our brains, they don't run hotter than other critters. I mean, we're at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit or a little bit, I think, is it warmer inside it? I think it's a core temperature. So I think that's the temperature even deep in the brain. Um, but, in there are other critters that run at a little bit, 103 degrees Fahrenheit or something. Um, and, small changes because the basic, the enzymes that we use are very temperature dependent and they probably just don't work. And awkward things like blood coagulating at higher temperatures and so on. But I don't know whether um, I actually it's a question I really don't know the answer to, is uh, whether we eat more because our brains. I mean, the brain is certainly a big user of um, uh, of energy in our body. I mean, I don't think it's I think the liver produces more heat, but I think the brain is still, I think, um, the brain is still up there in terms of producing heat and therefore using energy. I don't know. It's a good question. At what point uh, we'd be eating all the time? I mean, I sort of know anecdotally there are types of animals that don't eat so much, and their brains are, uh, you know, I think it's very hard to say, well, how smart the animal is. I mean, people have tried to make these indices of how smart animals are, and my attempts to sort of dig into that data, I've been sort of horrified by how hopelessly difficult it is. I mean, you see the videos of the different kinds of animals trying to open boxes with different levers and so on. And then you see, the big animals like the bears and things who are just like, I'm just going to smash this box. And then the video ends because maybe they did smash the box. Maybe they smashed the camera. I don't know. Um, but so it's hard to tell. But it's a good question what the sort of energy use of the bigger brains has to be, and whether right now in our brains about 1 billion neurons seem to be firing at any given time. And maybe it doesn't have to be as many, and maybe then it uses less energy. I'm not sure. And maybe as you go to something where more are firing, or maybe if you take an existing brain and you sort of run it hotter, let's say I'm going to get it up, I'm going to train myself so I can have 3 billion neurons firing at the same time. However you would do that, uh, maybe you need to eat more. I don't know. Um, Francis is asking, can the brain be optimized for size and shrunk? Can the same brain functionality be created in a smaller package? I think neurons are kind of a fixed size. I mean, there are lots of different kinds of neurons, but neurons, as they have been sort of created by biology, I think they're kind of a more or less fixed size. So if you're going to have a certain number of neurons, you're going to have a brain of a certain size, and it's all sort of packed in there as just a big pack of neurons, so to speak. Um, in terms of whether you can have sort of neuron-like things that are smaller than our neurons, I would say that I don't see any reason why that's impossible. There's certainly a big neurons, like the squid famously has the giant axon that goes all the way down the squid that allows it to very quickly, if you tickle one end, it really reacts at the other end, so to speak. So there are bigger ones. I don't know whether one can, under what circumstances one can make smaller ones, but that's kind of the limiting factor, I think. Uh, Gosh, Max is asking, I wonder if there's a limit to humor in terms of intelligence. Will it disappear entirely at some level? That is an interesting question. I mean, at different times, people have had different sort of explanations of humor. Humor is somehow the thing that connects these unconnected kinds of things. And I mean, my friend Marvin Minsky used to have a weird theory about humor, that people sort of laughed as a kind of spasm to somehow record to their brains the fact that the connections weren't really the connections that were supposed to be being made. I don't necessarily believe that theory. I'm trying to remember, we actually years ago organized a uh, little sort of meeting about computational humor. We were interested at that time in getting Wolfram Alpha to be able to make up jokes, um, and sort of to try and characterize what humor really is, and uh, what makes uh, it's sort of something about the unexpected, but also something about the uh, the kind of it's leading you in a direction that is I don't know, I suppose unexpected yet meaningful, so to speak. Now, how does that scale with size of brain? Good question. I mean, an experiment one could certainly do is with sort of differently sophisticated LLMs. What do you get? I mean, with the unsophisticated LLMs, sort of you were mostly getting very lame, repetitive humor. With sort of even ChatGPT sized LLMs, you get rather flat. I mean, I suppose that yeah, you're getting rather flat humor typically. And yeah, I don't know. It's a good question. I think it sort of relies on a theory of humor, which I think is something that is still a bit embryonic. Brady asks, could bigger brains visualize higher dimensional objects? Um, I think quite possibly, yes. I mean, it is a standard test for brains how well you can do mental rotation. So imagine a 3D object. Can you imagine in your mind being able to rotate that 3D object? Some people are really quite good at that. Some people, like myself, are quite bad at it. Um, can you imagine being able to rotate a 4D object? Uh, I don't know. One of my kids is really good at mental rotation. I should ask her. I know that um, uh, I I mean it is something where I can imagine that having more working memory is important. Um, but it's still a little bit mysterious what kind of what leads to the possibility of mental rotation. I know sort of anecdotally in the history of cognitive science, there was sort of a glitch in that because one of the people who studied that was themselves not to, or studied some of these cognitive processes themselves happened to be somebody who, like me, is not very good at mental rotation. And so that sort of led to various conclusions that weren't really right for the majority of brains. Um, I think, yeah, I mean, I would suspect the answer is more working memory, easier to do mental rotation. Um, but I'm not sure. And I don't, and I don't really know kind of what it takes to do that. I mean, I don't know really what one is doing when one is doing that. I mean, is one sort of forming a mental image and then being able to manipulate the mental image? Perhaps so. I mean, I'm more used to thinking that I'm manipulating word-like things rather than image-like things. So that's that may be what's happening there. The Pab asks, what does this mean for concepts like IQ? That's a reasonable question. Um, the um, I'm not a great believer in concepts like IQ. I mean, remembering, the history of these is about, the sort kind of idea of a general intelligence quotient is about 100 years old now. And it was originally just for very practical things like, recruits for the army, where were they going to go, those kinds of things. That there was sort of an attempt to figure out something that you could measure just like you can measure the height of somebody or something, you can measure it's sort of an uncontroversial thing to measure, measuring their sort of mental capabilities in the same kind of biometric type way was something people sort of thought, oh, it's going to be easy to do that. It turns out it's not easy, and there are many different dimensions of sort of that you could imagine looking at. I mean, in general, the question might be if you confront a person with this kind of problem, will they be able to solve it? And and so then the question is, can you get certain features that you can compute effectively for that person, which will be able to give you a good prediction of, if this person is in this social setting, will they be able to figure out what to do? If this person is given this math problem, will they be able to figure out what to do? Those kinds of things. And obviously, there's a certain amount of where if you are trained to operate in such and such a setting, you can do much better in that setting than if you're not. But there was sort of a conceit, an idea that if you gave people things that were sufficiently out in left field, that they've never seen them before, that you're kind of dealing with the raw mental ability, so to speak. I don't think that's very convincing. In fact, I've seen a whole series of efforts where people say, we're going to make a test that is so different from anything anybody's seen before that it's really testing some kind of raw ability. And then, of course, there are endless cheats for the test on the web, and people train for the test and so on. And the story does not really doesn't really repeat itself. I mean, it's kind of like standardized testing for college or whatever else. Again, it might be able to answer the question, will this person drop out of school in less than a year or something? And the answer to that, it might be able to answer, at least but whether it can answer, so anyway, I think the, a lot of sort of measurement of IQ ends up being things like these progressive matrices, like, find an object that fits in this box that does this and that and the other thing. There are now a number of tests like that for AIs. And in fact, I was just looking at one recently that sort of attempt to be sort of fundamental tests of something. I don't know. I find these things. So by the way, a couple of things to say. First of all, many of those tests, if you're prepared to just do raw computation, you can, in a way that human brains can't do, you can, in some cases, ace those tests. In some cases, those tests necessarily reflect sort of prejudices of humans. It's like, what's the most similar thing to this that fits in that? Well, you kind of have to have experience of the world, a human experience of the world to know that. And possibly some of the experience you have to have depends on the actual environment that you're in. I mean, I know I grew up in England, and I was exposed to a certain amount of sort of American, I don't know, almost testing concepts, and some of those things I can say that I couldn't figure out what on earth they were, because things like, oh, I don't know, something like the numbering of houses on a street, which in the UK tends to be, was at least in my day, was sequential, whereas in the US it's, the 100 block, the 200 block, the 300 block, and there's sort of the numbers are used just to give an ordering, not to give an absolute position. And if you don't know that, there's certain kinds of questions that are just absolutely incomprehensible. As an example, I think so. It's a strange. I This question of, is there sort of a the question of sort of how much computation can you do? That is a question that I think in the world of computational irreducibility, we can start to give a sense of an absolute measure of computation. But that is far away from a measure of what people might have identified as a human-like IQ type thing. And I think it will be interesting to understand for some of these kind of, yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think, some quotes IQ tests, AIs can ace, some they go splat on. I don't, my impression is they won't always go splat. And it's also the case that there's a surprising amount of learning, both explicit and implicit, that goes into any of those kinds of tests. Anyway, I'm not a huge believer in it depends on what you're trying to predict. As I say, if you're trying to predict performance on a very specific kind of thing, then you can absolutely test that. And some people will do better, some people will do worse. If you're trying to make it as a sort of a ranking of people, I think it's absolutely hopeless, and damaging to kind of imagine things that way, because it's kind of like higher score on IQ test means we'll be more successful at figuring out kind of new ideas and research. Absolutely not. Completely, different, different kinds of traits that are needed for those things. And I think I need to go to my day job in just a moment here. But Memes asks perhaps a good ending question. Are minds a result of having rulial limits? is it the case that a mind like ours, that having a mind-like thing is a consequence of being limited with respect to sort of rulial space? I think the answer is probably yes. I mean, it's kind of not, in some sense, what one hopes to hear, because we kind of like to think that we're sort of the top of the top. But actually, I think nature kind of has us outdone in terms of computation. We are really concentrated into this specific kind of computation that is this specific kind of sort of restriction in and I do think that the concept of our own coherent existence is also a result of sort of our restriction to a certain size. And it's kind of like if you say, is there a thing here? Well, if it's all concentrated right there, well, maybe yes. If it's spread out as a gas, all over the surface of the earth or something, you probably don't say it's a thing that's there. And I think it's the same kind of thing here, that this notion of coherent existence, individual coherent existence, depends on this limitation that you are small relative to everything that's possible. And I think also that it is a characteristic of sort of our finite minds that we're limited with respect to rulial space. And that gives us, I do think it's sort of a critical aspect of our experience that that's the way it is, leading to things like kind of the single thread of experience that is really key, I think, to our feeling of consciousness and so on. And I must say, as I was writing this piece, I was realizing that this fact that sort of brains came with animals, and animals are kind of things that are, there's just one animal and it's got to decide to go left or right type thing. It is a bizarre thought that the reason we have this whole stack, including sort of notions of consciousness and so on, is just because we're sort of, we have to decide where we're going to go. And this whole thing is sort of stacked on top of that very basic kind of requirement for the sort of viability of animals is both, is at some level is kind of, it tells us that we're sort of, we are the consequence of history, and even these very core features of us are the consequence of history. And talking of where one has to go, I need to go because I'm really late for things I'm supposed to do for my day job. But thank you very much for joining me for this. And you can find this piece in my writings website, got posted today. And it's a difficult piece, but I hope that I've been able to help sort of present it in a way that makes it more accessible. And there's much more to figure out along these lines. I'd love to be able to have more to say. I'd love to be able to know what Wolfram language for the bigger brain looks like and so on. I don't know that yet. Thanks for joining me. Bye for now.